So it looks like we are leveling out in terms of people joining. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So welcome everyone. We have a lot to cover today. So we are going to go ahead and get it introduced, get it started. My name is Benjamin Orr. I am the founder and executive director of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. For those of you who don't know us very well, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that believes every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. We really thank you for joining us for this vitally important conversation. While the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting everyone on some level, we are already seeing many ways that is magnifying the existing barriers to opportunity that too many Marylanders face, especially Black, Brown, and low-income people. Health data suggests that Black, Latinx, and some populations in the Asian American communities are more likely to get seriously ill or die if they become infected, for example. The initial data on job loss by gender shows that more women have lost work than men. We are waiting on better data by race and ethnicity, but because Black and brown workers are more likely to work in frontline service jobs, they are likely experiencing greater job loss. As schools try to continue instruction remotely, students in low-income communities, students with disabilities, and students of color are less likely to have access to the tools and support they need. And many of the steps so far to address the economic decline have left out the same groups that are most harmed. For example, experts believe that up to 90% of small businesses owned by women and people of color were shut out of the federal Paycheck Protection Loan Program. And almost all of the relief measures for families, including unemployment insurance and the stimulus checks, exclude undocumented immigrants and often their family members as well, regardless of their family members' status. The pandemic didn't create these barriers. They are built on a legacy of hundreds of years of racist policies, but it does provide another chance to address them. As we were saying earlier, the time is now. I am excited to welcome our two panelists today who will highlight policies that can help dismantle these structures that are holding people back in order to ensure the next economic recovery closes gaps rather than making them worse. First, we are pleased to have Dr. Khalilah Harris, who is one of our founding inaugural non-resident senior fellows here at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. She's also managing director for K-12 education policy at the Center for American Progress. Dr. Harris brings a unique perspective to her community organizing education to her work from an extensive career of working to expand access to opportunity through an equity lens in community organizing, in education and education policy, in youth advocacy, and through building inclusive workforce. Dr. Andre Perry will be our second panelist, and he is a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, a scholar in residence at American University, and a columnist for the Hechinger Report, a nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequality, and education. Dr. Perry is the author of the forthcoming book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I've already pre-ordered my copy, and others may find that interesting as well. We will kick off the conversation in just a moment. We do plan to leave plenty of time to respond to your questions at the end. If you are joining us on Zoom, you can submit them at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We also may have some folks joining us on Facebook Live. Is our overflow room, our virtual overflow room, and questions can be submitted on Facebook Live by commenting on the video. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the recording and other materials by email afterwards. So to begin, we're going to go to Dr. Harris, who's going to share some background on how the abrupt switch to remote instruction is affecting students and how this relates to existing structural problems within the school system. Khalilah?
Great, thanks, Ben. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. What I want to do is really just ground us in how critical it is for us to make sure we are, as I'm sure my colleague Andre will say coming up, double down on equity. What we know is if we go back to the 2007 recession, we had a Recovery Act that was set out to stabilize communities and support communities in maintaining some semblance of stability while we move back into higher employment rates. What we found, though, is that the 2008 ARRA, which was the bill that supported recovery across the nation, as it related to education, did not backfill for the many people who were laid off of their jobs. And in at least half of the 50 states and Puerto Rico, we found that, I think to date, those states have not returned to pre-recession funding for education. And so what we know is, despite having Mitch McConnell say that states can just go bankrupt, we're not going to borrow against future generations. We did borrow against this generation during the recession, and we have not seen state coffers go back to the pre-recession funding for education systems. So what does that mean right now? We saw in the election cycle in the spring, as the Democratic Party's nominations were underway and primaries were underway, that most of the, if not all of the main candidates were asking for quadruple the size funding of Title I dollars. So prior to this pandemic, there was clarity from leaders at every level of government that schools were not being equitably funded, and they were also crumbling around our students. We knew that there were gaps in between predominantly white school districts and school districts serving predominantly students of color to the tune of $23 billion annually. And what that pushes us forward to is today, during the pandemic, we see an immense digital divide. We have students in rural communities, students in urban cores who are not able to access any type of instruction to support their learning and to support parents continuing the learning that they were doing throughout the school year. We see high school students who at this time would have had a ton of access to do that transition, whether it be to community college or open access institutions, or simply sending forward the deposit for institutions they were already admitted to, now having very spotty, inconsistent access to guidance counselors who would have been supporting them in that. We see also students being thrust into distance learning with educators who were not required to develop those skills during teacher education or professional development. And those teachers also have experienced great trauma, but they're not being recognized as frontline workers in the way that some of our healthcare professionals, first responders, and others are being treated as frontline workers. They're being asked to suspend their own trauma to make sure their students are having some level of progress. What we know is that we cannot go back to what we had. It is time for us to architect schools that were working for everyone. Some students were seamlessly able to move into a distance learning model, but what we know is even in some of the more affluent public school districts, we were not prepared for a scenario where students didn't have to use the school building as their classroom. We can make a decision that that's not how we want to move forward. I think we need to slow down, frankly. Students are not going back to school this school year. I hate to say it for those of you holding out hope, and for those of you who knew it wasn't going to take place, but didn't say it out loud, say it out loud, because we really need to prepare. With so many parents losing their resources, students won't even be able to go to camp, even if camps were open in the summer, but that is also unlikely. So we're gonna have a chunk of time where all students K-12 have a gap. So for those of you who are concerned about whether or not they're gonna cover content or whether or not they're gonna be able to catch up, there's really no one for them to catch up to because they've all stopped at the same place. So grade level is a very arbitrary denomination. Let's think about student development. Let's slow down and recenter families in building and owning our schools. Community control over schools should accelerate right now, and we really need to slow down to put infrastructure in place for the long haul. Right now, we're in a period of response. And we see that with the federal grants that have come forward and the federal response through the CARES Act, but it was woefully inadequate. We're gonna see states whose receipts drop off anywhere from 5 to 30%. And what that will mean for funding is that there's gonna have to be decision made. And many states chose to decide to take away from future generations by decreasing resources for schools and not even keeping them at the level that they were prior to the recession. And we can't have that. So people who are wondering how are we getting back to school, what's the reopening plan? Any reopening plan that doesn't include a complete overhaul of what we think schools are for, and a structure that supports that, whether or not it's a student who can't go to school because there's no air or heat, or because a pandemic spikes for a second time. We have an opportunity right now to address the inequities that, again, when you have every candidate saying, I'm gonna quadruple Title I dollars and resources to cover the gap in equity for our public school students, that did not change by the pandemic. So the idea we would do less than that means that we wouldn't be serious about what we want for our children. And so we've had a response. The next stimulus that the Congress is going to put forward is really going to be about stabilization because of those gaps in receipts across the states. And then we also have to think about recovery. And recovery is not going to be next year or the year after that. Economists are predicting that we are going to go into a depression, not just a recession. And so that will have very long lasting impact. And we're going to have to move to make sure all of our students are getting the benefit of quality schools because they're going to exist in a new economy. We're not going to go back to what we were before, even if we hoped to, but we will not be, nor should we be creating structures and deciding how we use federal and state dollars to recreate the broken system we had before.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Now, Dr. Perry is going to offer some additional context about factors beyond the classroom that affect students' opportunity to learn.
Yes, first and foremost, I want to thank or send out condolences to all the individuals who've lost their lives to this coronavirus pandemic. I understand it's hard on us, and I just wanted to share that I'm with you, and we need to support each other in this endeavor. And also to MDCEP for organizing us. I'll start by just saying that if anything, this pandemic has taught us is how interconnected we are. That when our neighbors are sick, we are then vulnerable. And we see that medically. We also see that, we can put that in international terms. When a neighboring country is vulnerable, so are we. We're made clear about that reality, but it's always been the case, and it's true economically, socially as well, that when Black and brown people are not doing well economically, it throttles the economy. And a lot of people are in it and they don't feel it in the same way as obvious as the manifestation of death. But it's still true. When we deny opportunities to Black people, we limit the nature of the economy. And so I wanted to just lay that out there, that if we're really going to get through this, we got to make people less vulnerable. Making people less vulnerable means dealing with the structural inequalities that have persisted. I wanted this point that Maryland was on the right track when the Kirwan Commission released their report stating that they plan to insert $4 billion into education, because we know that the current education financing system is broken, that's predicated on property taxes, structurally creates inequalities. That neighborhoods with certain home values get more money, and we know that neighborhoods where there's low income residents, they need more resources. So there's always been a structural problem with getting resources to the districts and the students and the families who need it. And I say that to say that what happens during these times, we abandon many of the equity issues or equity programs that would actually help us deal with the next inevitable crisis. The $4 billion that the Kirwan Commission designated is still needed. If we do not address these structures, when the next epidemic hits, we'll be right back in the same situation that we're in now, that we have no choice but to work on structural inequality. One of the studies that I talk about all the time as it relates to education is my housing devaluation study that my colleagues at Brookings and Gallup did, where we looked at home values and we compared home prices in Black majority neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And we compared those homes to white neighborhoods where the share of the population is less than 1%. And we controlled for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. And that cumulatively across the country, that amounts to about $156 billion in lost equity. That $156 billion is used by individuals to start businesses. It's used to send your kid to college. It's also used by municipalities to fund schools, to help with infrastructure, for policing. So that structural issue is limiting growth in education, in policing, in quality policing, in infrastructure. All of these things impact student learning. I say this all the time, that kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. If we don't address the structural issues that impact communities, students will be more at risk, not only medically, but educationally, socially, and professionally. And just a few points I just want to raise, that I lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. One of the things that I learned from that is that we're probably going to expect a mass exodus from teachers aged around 55. We'll probably expect a lot of early retirements, largely because people won't want to deal with the potential austerity measures that states take, which will impact schools. If you don't see a true stimulus package that adds resources to state budgets, they will cut services and people that help make teachers and leaders' job easier. So all the support specialists, the parent liaisons, all those folks who don't have labor protections, their jobs will be in danger. And so I encourage everyone to work with their labor leaders, their various organizers, SEIU, if need be, because this is going to be a fight. Because as most people know, many of the essential workers that are out there right now risking their lives are Black and brown, and they're putting their lives at risk every single day. And when we quote unquote go back to normal, those same people will be at risk of getting laid off and fired. And so we have to do our best to protect them. And that means fighting for funding at the state level to meet those needs. We should have that $4 billion infused over the next 10 years in terms of Maryland. That should still be a goal. And if you ease up on that, you're essentially going to lose another opportunity to correct the system. that obviously put us in, that made too many people vulnerable. And so I'll leave it there. But again, we're in this together. It's time that we acted as if we were. If we wanted to shore up the vulnerabilities, that means dealing with the structural inequalities that currently exist.
Thank you. You know what, your point about the distribution of resources being perpetuating structural inequality, or being both a cause and a outcome of structural inequality, reminds me also not so much the focus of this panel, but the work that the Maryland Center on Economic Policy does on both how those resources get allocated is unequal, and also who pays where we collect those resources from is also unequal. Here in Maryland, for example, if you make more than $500,000 a year, you pay less in taxes as a share of your income, in state and local taxes as a share of your income, than if you make less than $24,000 a year. It's that proverbial billionaire paying a smaller share of income taxes than their secretary kind of thing, or administrative assistant. I want to shift to some questions here, and we've got a couple of questions the three of us talked about before, and then we've also got some questions from the audience we'll also get to. So first of all, I think we've talked about this moment, and I think my question first to you both is, what might the long-term implications be for failing to center equity in addressing these systemic issues that you both are raising up that existed pre-pandemic? What's the long-term situation?
Well, I mean, the long-term situation, we're going to widen the racial wealth gaps, the educational gaps, the income gaps, if we don't fix these issues. Again, the reason why Black and brown people are put in this position is because of bad policy. As it relates to COVID, clearly COVID does not discriminate, but our past policies have. And those past inequities are showing up in the number of deaths that are overrepresented by Black people. And so we've got to address that issue. But inequality has, people say what will happen. Black people are already living what happens when we ignore structural inequality. We're already seeing the consequences. I'll just state read off a few facts in terms of business. We know that Black people represent about 13% of the US population, but we only represent about 4% of the nation's 22 million business owners. In addition, only 1% of Black owners were able to obtain loans in their founding year, compared to 7% of white entrepreneurs. When Black people do receive loans, they're at worse rates, even though they may qualify for better rates. This is the tragedy we're currently living with and having to deal with during this time. And so yet again, we have another opportunity to address the structures. And it can mean, it means that we need a racial equity lens when we are distributing resources. And if we don't, we'll see the same things that we're seeing now in regards to testing. It's unfathomable, but the workers we deemed essential are not being tested, particularly in the South. And yet we're saying we're lauding them as heroes. We're saying that we're thanking them, but but our government agencies are not extending that thank you with equitable policy. They're essentially allowing them to work at and put themselves in harm's way. So I don't think we'll see anything different than what we are currently seeing. I think if we do nothing, it will we will continue to see the epidemics Black Americans and Brown Americans are facing today.
Helps if I unmute myself. Khalilah, I think I want to shift gears here a little bit to more concretely focus on the education realm. I think that we've gotten a number of audience questions. They're fairly specific to education. So I kind of want to pivot here and talk. I know you have a lot of experience with Maryland system, and so one of the questions that we have is, so state leaders are suggesting in Maryland and elsewhere, in Maryland, schools are currently only canceled through mid-May. As you said, probably that will extend to the end of the year and go to, and who knows, over the summer. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the impact of those delays on communities of color. And then maybe as part of that, one of our audience members particularly called out the conversation that's happening about the potential for staggered school hours for students in the new school year, having a limited number of students in the building at any one time, for example, and that sort of thing. Are these things even feasible, or what would be the benefits or disadvantages of some of these more, some of the new creative ideas that are bubbling up, I guess?
Great, thanks, Ben. First and foremost, a staggered start and some of the other ideas that we see coming forward are really nonsensical. And I'll couple these two questions together. First and foremost, schools that continue to be closed have children in them whose families may go back to work. And so our healthcare system is spotty right now. Daycare providers have not been able to provide services and have had to close because they've not had access to some of the PPP funds. And we see in Black and Latinx and some Asian American communities really extreme impacts of just this short window of us being shut down. So, your previous question about what the long-term implications would be, I think if we do nothing, we will see things get extremely, extremely worse, right? If we only do a little, we may be able to maintain the status quo, but we know that was not working for our children. So you have families who aren't necessarily working, or you have children in families who must work, but school is closed. And summer camps then are closed. And there's a digital divide because we're not going to have nationwide broadband in 30 days, in 60 days. So, it's really going to be important for us to really think about how schooling happens in the community with the school building as an anchor. Because even with a delayed start, right, I'll take that question, that point. Even with a delayed start, absent a vaccine and absent a clear protocol for treating, everyone's going to be passing the virus back and forth to each other. We will flatten the curve, we will spike again. We will flatten the curve, we will spike again until we're able to have a vaccine. And so the idea that some people will send their kids into a school building, my children won't be without a vaccine existing or a clear protocol. Contact tracing, right? So figuring out, using a public app that lets us know if we've been in contact with someone who's been diagnosed. Right now, none of those things exist in our country. In other countries, like South Korea, contact tracing happened immediately because they'd experienced SARS. Absent those things occurring, we will not know where spikes are predictable, and our children will continue to get sick. So if you have a school of 1,000 children, saying that 2,500 will be on campus on Monday and Wednesday, and then a different on Thursday and Friday, doesn't negate that you have 250 children in the building. And that is not safe. And it's also not tenable, because then you start exacerbating inequity again. Which students are going to be able to go to school? which students are going to be able to keep up under that new pace again, right? So we will have our students in a perpetual state of trauma. And something even more critical that I want to make sure we surface today in the face of this pandemic is there are children who who school districts across the country have not made contact with. Saw a piece today in the LA Times, or a couple of days ago in the LA Times, that thousands of children have not been touched by an educator. They have not been contacted. They can't reach their families. And so those are just families who, for whatever reason, either might be going through crisis or don't have access to the same phone numbers, as sometimes that changes in some communities. But what we see is a situation where I heard of another district where 40% of the children are still unaccounted for. In other districts, including Baltimore City, we've seen students come back to school initially through distance learning, and then they stop coming. Either because they can't keep up, it's overwhelming, life is happening, they're caring for siblings. They've fallen off of the numbers. So with all of that said, as again, we have to slow down before we speed up. We cannot go back to the same school structure, even if we wanted to, because absent a vaccine, that will not happen. So how do we use public access television? How do we use our museums? How do we use the park across the street as it gets warmer to bring groups of 10 students on a social distancing basis to continue to learn to master concepts, as opposed to what we were thinking about before, covering content. And covering content has nothing to do with whether or not you're mastering a set of skills, how to do critical thinking. And so we see parents now running around saying that they're homeschooling. A, they're not homeschooling unless they were homeschooling parents before. B, they should not be homeschooling. If their student is in a public school, they should be learning with their teachers and then content being reinforced. But that goes back to the state of trauma we're all in. So when we think about what it means for schools to open, the concept of regular is out the window. And it is going to be imperative for us to really think through how to allow communities, or to facilitate communities reclaiming control of schools, because we're clear what our students need. And developmentally, students are in 3 or 4 age bands. They're not on a grade by grade basis. And so we need to disabuse ourselves of those concepts of what it takes to structure school. Furthermore, it's very easy in states of crisis for concepts of equity to be an afterthought. We've been talking for the past 5 years about cultural responsiveness, culturally affirming practice, culturally sustaining practice. No one's talking about that right now. And so we have some communities who know how to do schooling, particularly in indigenous communities. We know we have communities who understand how to bring their young people into a circle to observe the world around them, to think about politics in the community, to think about how they fit in this world. So the idea that we go back to a system that was not set up to support Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and some children from the AAPI community, why would we at all want to go back to that structure? Roles weren't working for people who have been grounded in cultural practices of their ancestors. So if we want our children to go back to that, we need to check ourselves and figure out if we want them to be able to be a part of this nation's future success, or we don't.
It almost seems to me, I was thinking as you were talking about people in the community who know how to bring people into circle and into community together, and being outside of this classroom, but still learning. I think about the energy that might bring to solving the problems that we all see around us too, and the hope that that might give us. We have a specific question from someone who I think is in Baltimore City about how are we dealing with equity in schools that are Title I? Budgets have been frozen and money is being recaptured, but we don't know for what. So are there plans out there? How will children be cared for? What's the situation with Title I schools, I guess, is the bottom line question here in this particular context right now.
So I'll just take this really quickly. Baltimore City Public School District is a entirely Title I. So the concept that we ask about those schools that are Title I and those schools that are not, there are a few schools in the school district that are not Title I, which is why we were able to be classified as an all Title I school district. So what does that mean for Baltimore City and districts around the country that are similar? We have communities where food coming from these school-based sites is exponentially more than what they were feeding children during the school day and school year. And why is that? Because of the pre-existing inequity. We now have people getting fed who were not eating before. So where do you place that? As Andre said, schools are anchors in our communities. And the idea that schools are anchors in our communities, but they are not standalone. There's going to be no solution for our children that the school system alone is responsible for. So when you think about how we are serving students who might have been in a school where families have a high concentration of poverty, the question is, what is the entire city doing about that, right? Why are all of these people now surfacing who had no food and we weren't feeding them before? How is it that we have all of a sudden clear issues with contacting our children? Well, were we worried about whether or not the children were homeless before, or just surviving or couch surfing with their parents? Were we worried about whether or not that red line was being built in Baltimore to make sure people could get from one side of town to the other side of town? Or were we just so proud of the nice words that the governor said? We weren't listening for our own needs. We were listening to what he told us he gave us. And so here we are. Transportation, housing, jobs, all of those things serve children in Title I schools. So until we decide that we're going to provide those things for community, we can't stop and say, well, how are the Title I schools all of a sudden serving their children? They weren't really servicing them before. There were a lot of Band-Aids happening. There were not enough social workers, not enough guidance counselors, class sizes too large. So you see, it's a snowball, because what we're seeing now are all the things that educators and families were saying were depriving their children of a human right. According to the United Nations, we were depriving our children of human right to education. And just last week, the federal courts apparently say the Constitution says so as well. But absent our providing for communities' economic development, and in Baltimore City, we have a mayoral election coming. Absent the community's leaders talking about economic development and schools being a part of that strategy, we will not be able to serve families and children, students with disabilities, students who are experiencing homelessness, foster youth, English language learners, and that is the fastest growing population of Baltimore City schools, which many people are not aware of. So all of those populations right now are at a severe loss. I talked about abuse and not being able to find our children. We have students in the LGBT community where school was their safe haven, students who are suffering domestic violence or sexual abuse, or have a parent who is suffering from domestic violence. All of those children are now locked into a prison of our poor choices. So we can use policy to unravel that.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to add just a few things, some of it which was from the last question. One, we should, as Khalilah, Dr. Harris stated, that we need to do a statewide roll call, that we're losing students every day that they're not in school. And so we need, from a very practical stance, do a statewide roll call. Districts need to account for their students. In addition, we need to live with the fact that we're going to have some kind of distance learning for a long period to come. And that means, I've written about this in a recent article in the Heckender Report, that we really need to look at summer school as being part of our everyday schooling. That, and to utilize this distance learning that we're becoming better at as a way to fill some gaps in the summer. So eventually, a year and a half from now, when we have a vaccine, hopefully, that we should not allow ourselves to stop providing educational services in the summer, where we know there's a summer slide, summer melt, summer learning loss, whatever term you want to use. So I strongly advocate that we look at this moment as a time to say, well, how do we change what we're doing? And clearly we need to adopt some social distancing, some distance learning platforms. But again, as Dr. Harris stated, we're going to exacerbate inequalities if students don't have a Wi-Fi and computers. Now, what's interesting about that is how quickly we found laptops and hotspots in a pinch, which raises the question, why didn't they give them out in the first place? If districts could do this before, and cities could do this before, and we know that a computer is just as important, if not more important, than a math book, that these are essential tools that should be distributed. But again, the teachers know how to teach face-to-face, and they actually may have been trained in some of the things that they're using now. But your mother is what is it? Is the mother? No, the necessity is the mother of invention. There you go. And what this epidemic has done is force people to learn this technology. And so as we get more practice, people will be able to use it better. But again, it should be used to fill current gaps, and that's in the summer. But I can't say this enough. If we don't restore the budgets to the more than what they were before, districts will use technology to usurp teachers. And we've also seen this, where they've, in order to optimize budgets, they have eliminated teachers. And so we've got to push back against that issue. And I blanked on the last question, but I wanted to pick up where Khalilah, Dr. Harris left off on that last question. You're muted.
Great. So thank you. So we have way too many questions
that
we're going to be able to get to. But I think there are a number of questions in here that I think probably can occupy our time over the next 13 minutes in a pretty significant way. And I think they all boil down to really, in a concrete way, what are the sorts of policies or actions that our audience members should be thinking about advocating for within their own communities, within their own states, here in Maryland or elsewhere in the country, because we know we have some people on from outside of Maryland. What are there models out there of structural change that truly operate with a racial equity lens, and how do we push these things forward? What are kind of the next steps that we as citizens who care about these things should be pushing for, as residents of our communities should be pushing for?
So why don't we go right? We were kind of at the grass tops. Let's go down to the grassroots, where grassroots anchors the grass, right? Without it, there's nothing we can do. People aren't able to take advantage of us, those people at the grass tops, without us. So that's something we should keep in mind. But at the grassroots level, there are a number of things that can be done. First and foremost, particularly in communities of color, the way they engage at the legislative process is often at the tail end. So either they are trying to renegotiate something that someone put out, or they're protesting a new law that was passed or failed to pass. What folk need to be clear of is there is no them. There is no them. They did this to us. We need to ask them for this. We need to get that from them, or they said that this is allowable or not allowable. You can create and design and come together in community. People are forming Facebook groups about all kinds of things. My era at Morgan State University, we have our own Facebook group with thousands of people who are constantly in community with people we haven't seen for almost 3 decades, right? So, you know, we can do this. Power does not exist with people who happen to be elected to office. If you ask anybody who does legislative advocacy, ask them about what it looks like when they're in their state legislature in January through April or January through June, however long your session is. And what legislators will say is people do not come to their office. People do not actually call them at the rate they would expect when there's something that's important to them. And a part of that is designed in the system that we live in right now, this supposed democracy that we live in right now, that people feel like they are powerless from making legislative change or policy change, so that people who want to maintain power over them can do so. So it's important for community members, if you feel like the school year should not start on a staggered basis, then you need to begin to establish a grassroots organized strategy, a telephone network, telephone game strategy to get people to call your legislators and say, and so that's not only at the state level, it's also at your municipality level. So in Baltimore City, that would be city council. It could be an alderman somewhere. Whatever the case may be, you can start the drumbeat on what you expect from community. When I talk about redesign, actually, I really am not fond of the redesign term, because we need to build something new, right? We should not take what existed and just mush it up a little bit and say, okay, this seems like it'll provide equity and access for students. So you can go to your school boards immediately, which are still having meetings via Zoom and teleconference. You can start reaching out to your legislators to make sure that they write bills in the fall. First of all, most states you can have a special session. So if you want a special session to happen by the end of the summer, so you can help have laws that facilitate the type of schools you want, start putting demand out for that immediately. The current commission, for example, had a trigger entered in the last day, I want to say last 48 hours of the abbreviated session. And that trigger was that if receipts fall below 7.5%, the Kerwin funding would not take effect. Maryland is going to be somewhere between 15 and 20% lower in receipts. So let that sink in for you. What do you want to prioritize? What do you want your mayor to prioritize, your city council to prioritize, and your state legislatures? And not only say it to them, but work through your network. People are using social media at explosive rates. You begin to organize, you talk to one person, they'll do it with you. You both talk to one person, that's 4 people. But there's no reason for you to wait for someone else to set up some structure for you to weigh in on what you want to see in your children's schools, your neighbor's schools, your job if you work at a school. That can start immediately. Just start having conversations and don't wait for someone to come and save you. Because the easiest thing for people to do would be to reconfigure things so it's a lot like it was before.
Dr. Perry, I'm sure you have an answer to this too. I just want to jump in and say, here in Maryland specifically, so Annapolis can be a very small town, and it can sometimes take only a few phone calls to really make a difference on an issue. It's also really important that people remember that the legislature is not necessarily where decisions are going to be made at the moment. Our legislative body is out of session. The governor has a lot of power by going through the Board of Public Works to make cuts outside of the legislative session. And so that's where paying attention to what the Board of Public Works and the governor is proposing to the Board of Public Works in Maryland is going to be particularly important as we look at what happens with education funding, healthcare funding, et cetera. So I just wanted to mention that for folks to pay attention to as well. Dr. Perry?
Yeah, and I'll be very brief with this because I think Dr. Harris outlined a lot of good things there. I just wanted to say that in terms of racial equity, the Kerwin Commission was actually a progressive document. I mean, compared to what other states are doing, I don't see any reason why you should not continue to fight for that. But it will require cities determining and other municipalities determining what they want to prioritize. In moments like this, educational institutions always get short shrift, always. This is our time to say, hey, not again. Every time there's a recession and we have got to prioritize, education falls way down. And so I think this is more about a political fight than one where we're searching for ideas. You worked hard to develop a concrete policy. Now you got to work hard to maintain it. And so, yes, certain numbers can change, but the principles behind that document should not. We need to create structures that allow districts to have more funding so that students can have a fair shot at getting a decent education. And again, education is somewhat symbolizes what's happening across the country. We do not test, we do not pour resources in to Black and brown communities, and when something happens, we say, well, we don't have time, or we shouldn't do this at this time, and Black and brown people get further left behind on all these things. So I just think that you have something in Maryland. You know, the goal is to fight for it to exist in the post-COVID moment.
We maybe have a time for one more very short question, and shifting gears slightly about housing. You mentioned earlier about homes being devalued in Black neighborhoods. I know there was a Johns Hopkins study that found that even prior to the housing bubble crash in 2008, Black households were losing home value while white homeowners were building home value. For example, is there research or data that's available that talks about that more currently, and sort of where do they expect things to go in the next 6 months?
Yeah, while we're passing out checks to people, we should be helping to address the housing devaluation gaps that exist between Black and white neighborhoods. We created the study I mentioned. We can see where homes are devalued, and it has a lot to do with the racial composition in it, not because of the quality of home, not because of the social conditions. And so there are ways to restore value. Certainly we need programs that allow low-income residents to buy low-income or low-price property. Right now, banks simply don't back $30,000 homes. And when you're talking about, there's lots of places, including Detroit, Baltimore, lots of places where the home prices are so low, you can buy them, but no bank will back a mortgage like that. And so we need new products to allow people to get in homes. And for people who live in areas where home prices are devalued, we should have micro loans so that people can fix up their property because of that. Those resources that are lost, people use to generally for home improvements and a lot of other things. So there are things that but unfortunately, those kind of housing policies were left out largely of the various the four spending bills. And so we eventually got to address housing, or again, school districts will always be underfunded if you don't have a policy in place to correct those.
Yeah.
If I can add to that quickly, Ben, I know we are about to head out. You know, coupled with policy, I'm going to say something which shouldn't be controversial, but may sting a little bit. People who live in those communities also need to not invest in them, they need to remain in them. And people who are from those communities really need to think about the concept that the white man's water is wetter. And there are certainly studies that show school valuation or the ranking of schools is also connected to how people perceive schools that have a certain percentage, more or less, of white people in it. And so you've seen studies where there are two schools in close proximity. The school that is predominantly white is rated higher. The school that is predominantly populated by the new majority in terms of students of color, that it'll have a lower ranking, even if the students are performing better than the predominantly white school. And so in some ways, certain communities are going to have to stop waiting on rankings from white heteronormative culture and decide that there is value where they live and under their feet. The streets may not be paved with gold, but they're certainly paved with the sweat and toil of your ancestors. So it would make sense for us to take steps to not only enact policy. I see some questions here about how do we all do those crucial things? We don't all have to do anything. We all come with a skill set. We need to understand our lane and understand the goal and vision we have for our communities. And in addition to that, as it relates to schools, if we remain in communities, decide that we don't need to live in a community that someone somewhere told us was better than where we were raised, then, you know, no policy is going to address that. So in the same ways people talk about integration as a silver bullet, you can't integrate schools in Detroit and Baltimore because there aren't enough white people. And the idea that we should continue what we did after Brown v. Board and have students go to places that did not want them, instead of having the money and resources go to the children and families, we're going to be in a constant cycle of, well, people don't want to live there. People don't want to send their kids to that school. So it's going to be critical now more than ever that we both use some of the policies that Dr. Perry discussed, but we also, again, facilitate community anchoring itself and doing things that we've done for centuries in this country, which is to make community when others say no community exists.
Well, thank you. We are a minute over at this point. We're going to send a follow-up email with links to some of the studies that we talked about. Thank you to both Dr. Harris and Dr. Perry for joining us. Thank you to all our audience members for submitting their thoughtful questions. Please stay in touch. You can keep up with the latest Maryland policy developments by following the Maryland Center on Economic Policy on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, sign up for our email list to make sure that you hear about future webinars. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Stay dry.